Hey, welcome to General Epistles. And we have been going through a lot of the letters in the New Testament here. And today we are going to be looking at the book of Hebrews. And so if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there. We're going to try to give you a quick overview here. So the book of Hebrews is sort of a mystery of books. To the early church, when they were developing the canon, they were looking for books that had the handprint of the apostles on it, and they felt like the book of Hebrews had that handprint. But the early church, as they were building the canon, we're not sure who wrote it. We're not sure who it was directly, who may have first read it. But it is a major book in the New Testament, and the early church did decide that this book had had the imprint of the apostles on it, and became a book that was encouraging. Probably Jewish Christians were some of the first readers, and so possibly in Rome. The theme of Hebrews is that Jesus holds the highest place in God's plan for salvation. And we're going to hear this kind of repeated. Jesus is superior to different things, especially those things in the Old Testament. And so we will pick up on that. So Hebrews describes the qualities and actions of Christ. And the following 10 passages are important to understand the full picture of Christ. In 1 through 4, he is the heir of all things. In 2 chapter 10, he's the captain, or some translations may say the author of salvation. 2:14, he's the destroyer of the devil, which the devil and death are our enemies. 2:17, he's a faithful priest. In 3:3, he's worthy of more glory than Moses. And we're going to talk about that here in a moment. 4:15, he's a high priest who knows our weaknesses. He can relate to us. In 7:25, he intercedes. In chapter 8, verse 6, he's a mediator of a new covenant. The old covenant was that, excuse me, the old covenant was that with that was in the Old Testament, and it was given to Abraham and to Moses. He models for us enduring troubles as from sinners, and then he's also a great shepherd. And there's also some warnings of advice in this passage: a warning against drifting from the truth, a warning against disbelieving the voice of God, a warning against falling away from the elementary principles of Christ, a warning against despising the knowledge of the truth, and a warning about the grace of God being devalued, and then a warning not to depart from him who speaks. So some of our key words: more excellent, high priest, mercy, Melchizedek, eternal, faith, covenant. These are going to be words that are going to appear. So we begin just kind of an overview of the different chapters here, starting, and I'll just be highlighting parts in the book here. We won't get focused on any one thing and remain there. We have to keep moving on here. But God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in a time past to the fathers by the prophets, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. So God is, in the beginning of Hebrews, is just telling us that God's going to speak to us in a new way. This is a new time. Something has happened in world history with Jesus coming. In the past, he used prophets, but now he's going to use Christ, and Christ is a better way for God to speak, and we're going to realize that Jesus is not just a mere prophet, nor any spokesman, but he is the exact representation of the Father. And so he becomes, we're learning that, and as early Christians will call this the Trinity, that he is a part of the Godhead, and so God himself is appearing before us. He starts out, begins to explain who Jesus is, that he's better than the angels. And excuse me, God speaks of Christ in a way that he doesn't speak of the angels. The writer uses Old Testament passages to show that Christ is better. Angels were considered sons of God, but they were never the Son of God. And so that's an important message. Christ is the creator, right? This was something that was only attributed in the Old Testament. It was only attributed to Yahweh. And so now that we attribute it to Christ, we realize that he too is a part of this Godhead. So these are huge words that will shake many people. One of the key words, more excellent, the writer uses this word for better or more excellent 15 times in the book of Hebrews. And he's going to speak on things that Christ is better or more excellent from things that they've had before, whether it be he's superior to the angels, or he's better than the old covenant because he's brought a new covenant, or better than Moses. We'll continue to hear these themes. So by the time we get to chapter 2, there's a warning not to drift away based on opinions. So he kind of focuses on the gospel and make sure to stay focused on that. Disobeying the law brought punishment, but rejecting the gospel will bring even greater harm. So God confirms the gospel message that is brought through miracles. Christ then in chapter 2 is the perfect man, and that's going to be important. And that's how the church saw Jesus. They saw him fully divine as God, but they also saw him as fully human. But in his humanness, he subjects himself, puts himself under. And so in the Hebrew writer says that Christ was made lower than the angels. He became human. And so we cannot have Christ without his humanness. Because Christ was human, he could get back the authority humans lost because of sin. So Jesus becomes the perfect perfect human. He's made like us. And so verse 10, he says, "For it was befitting for him, for whom all things and by whom all things, in bringing many sons to glory, to make the captain or the author of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For both he who sanctifies and those who are being sanctified are all one, for which he is not ashamed to call them brethren." And so this is the work of Jesus. He's able to do this. So he is the captain, again, or the word author. So he's the captain. This means that he's the first one to lead the way. So this has been the whole story of the Bible, that God was going to send somebody who would show us how to be human again, and what that meant. And so Jesus, he went through suffering and became the perfect leader. And so that is important. Because Jesus became flesh and died on the cross, he defeated the devil's power of death over believers. Remember when Adam and Eve sinned, they brought death into the world, and the devil kind of took a position or a place that was never belonging to him. And so Jesus dies on the cross, allows mankind to put him there, and he defeats death for one final blow. And so he, in verse 17, therefore, in all things, he had to be made like his brethren, that he might be merciful and faithful, a high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. And so Jesus suffered, and he died on the cross, and he's able to imitate, in a sense, well, not in a sense, but in reality, he takes on suffering as well. So as we move into chapter 3, he becomes, the writer says that he is better than Moses. And what's important is that Moses is a big deal, right, in the Jewish faith. And the writer wants us to know that Jesus is even a bigger deal. And so a lot of times Jesus was challenged and about who he was, and the different Jews would say, hey, we know Abraham, he was great, we know Moses. And so this is a way that the Hebrew writer is saying, hey, listen, Jesus is even greater than all of them. And so he's counted worthy. Christ was faithful when he obeyed the Father. So in verse 5, it says, and Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant for a testimony of those things which would be spoken afterward. But Christ as a son over his own house, whose house we are, if we hold fast the confidence and rejoicing of hope firm to the end. So Jesus is building Moses built this house, he was building this community. Jesus is building a new house, a new community. In verse 7 through chapter 4, verse 13, some words of advice. Trust the word, do not doubt it. This section is really based on Psalm 95, summarizes the history of Israel under Moses. And as we know, they had these trials, they didn't trust, they didn't find the rest that they were supposed to find. And so the Hebrew writer is trying to say, hey, listen, let's not be like them, right? Let's trust, and let's not be hardened by sin. Let's not depart from the living God. But let's exhort one another. Let's encourage one another. Let's share responsibilities. Ultimately, let's partake, be partakers of Christ, sharing with Christ in this heavenly kingdom. A lot of Jewish Christians, they wanted to return to the Jewish system. But the Hebrew writer is saying, listen, the Jewish system was just temporary. It was pointing to Jesus. Ultimately, Jesus is the answer to this whole system. So the writer of Hebrews warns those who have heard the gospel and God's word over and over again, and yet have not acted on it. In other words, they're rejecting what God is doing. And so the Holy Spirit has been revealing this. And so just like the people in the wilderness who hardened their hearts, he's saying, don't harden your hearts here. God is doing what he said he was going to do. He's introducing something new. And so he's seeking to encourage the church to be faithful. And so the writer gives us a personal plea today. If you will hear, right, my voice, God is doing something new. Trust in that. And so the tragedy of the Israelites in the desert is really a warning for believers. The promise of the rest still stands, but this rest now is going to be in Jesus. God still keeps his promises, the promises he made through David. And in Jesus, God has kept his promise that he was going to give the people a rest. And this word rest is going to be an important word. He goes on in verse 8 there in chapter 4, if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not afterwards have spoken of another day. In other words, what God was doing was not going to be just simply completed in Israel, but God was doing something bigger that was going to bring something to the whole world. And so, and he began to speak of these things through his servant David of another day. And a Sabbath rest remains for God's people in the future. In other words, we find rest in Jesus, but there's something even future coming. And so he says in verse 11, let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest. Let anyone should fall according to the same example of disobedience. In other words, let's not repeat the same mistake that was made before. As we go on, Christ is better than the priesthood of Aaron. Of course, within Israel, the priesthood is very important. The high priest is an important person. The high priest was the highest religious leader in Israel, and Israel went to the high priest to find the will of God. They were also, their sins were atoned for each year as the high priest entered into the holy and the most holy place. And in the Old Testament, the high priest went into this most holy place on the Day of Atonement. The picture here is that Jesus is even greater than this, because Jesus went into the heavenly sanctuary and he finished the work of atonement, because the sins could never be forgiven completely. But Jesus does a complete work. He's able to do this. He's able to sympathize with our weakness, right? Because Jesus was human. He knew suffering. And so we can come to the throne of grace because we have a high priest that we can relate to. Because Christ did the work of a priest, believers can come near to God. And Jesus is qualified, right, to be our high priest. In the Old Testament, the high priest must be a person that God calls. No one chooses for himself to be a high priest. And so Jesus is called to be our high priest, the final high priest. And so the high priest was sinful. Aaron and the other high priests to follow were sinful, but they set this line of priests, and God called Christ to be the ultimate high priest. And so Christ was human, and God called him. He was qualified to be a high priest. It says there in Hebrews that he learned obedience. Jesus obeyed God's will. Having been perfected, Jesus was perfect. Perfected means to be carried, means that he carried out God's plans. And as a result of doing this, he becomes a source of eternal life, because Jesus completed the plan here. Remember, we were made to live forever. Sin brings death into the world, and Jesus then corrects that. So a couple key words: mercy and grace often appear together in this letter. Mercy is God actively helping those in need, and grace is God's tendency to treat us with kindness that we don't necessarily deserve. So there's some words of advice. Don't become dull. Press on to spiritual maturity. And this is an encouragement to those that the Hebrew writer is writing to. He talks about first principles. In other words, this phrase means, get back to some of the basic truths. He talks about unskilled. The readers had information, but their actions did not match. In other words, they may have heard these words, but they weren't living them out. And certainly application can be made of that of Christians today. Elementary principles of Christ, truths the readers had learned already, but they weren't putting into practice. He says the milk here is all of God's word, but the meat is the practice. So milk's important, right? Babies need milk, but we need meat to live on. And so the idea here is to put both the word and practice into place. And so these are important to follow. As we move closer to chapter 6, I just want to highlight some things. God will keep his promises. God made a promise to Abraham. Abraham's faith is an example. He believed God's promise. And so there's two immutable things. One, immutable means, not changing. And that is God's promise, which does not change, right? And God's oath, which does not change. And so God is going to keep this. In verse 19 and 20, this hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence beyond the veil, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become the high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And we're going to talk about him in a moment. So some key words in that verse: anchor, hope in Christ holds us firmly in place as an anchor holds a ship. Beyond the veil, the most holy place, right, was covered by a veil. And so Jesus has entered in that. He was a forerunner. He goes into the presence of God. So let's talk about the priesthood now. In chapter 7 through 10, he has this long dialogue about the priesthood. There's a better line of priests. The priesthood of Melchizedek is better than the line of the priesthood from Aaron. Now we are introduced to Melchizedek, right, with Abraham, and we don't know where he came from, but he plays the part of a priest. And so Melchizedek points to Christ, the eternal priest. And he appears to Abraham, and yet Melchizedek, the scripture tells us, was greater than the patriarch Abraham, which is saying a lot. And so the lesser, which is Abraham, is blessed by the better, which is Melchizedek. And so Abraham pays tithes to Melchizedek as a priest. And so we're introduced to Melchizedek, right, in the Old Testament. And we also learn about him not only through Abraham, but through the Song of David in Psalm 110. He was a king of Jerusalem, and he blessed Abraham in the name of the true God. And Abraham gave him, his tithes and offerings. Well, Christ replaces the priesthood of Aaron, right? Because now he's our high priest. Jesus can go in before us. So the law of Moses and the priesthood went together. All people were sinners. They needed a priest to make sacrifices for their sin. And so Jesus becomes this high priest. And David announced that a new priest was coming. So he's better than the priesthood of Aaron. Okay. And that he's our high priest. He's a guarantee of things that are come. The oath guarantees a better covenant. Christ's priesthood doesn't change. In the Old Testament, the priest would change when one would die, but Jesus is not going to die, so he's going to be a high priest forever. Next word we'll introduce is the writer of Hebrews stresses that Christ's work is permanent, right? That it's eternal. Jesus, the high priest, he was qualified. He knows our weakness. He called him. He was like Melchizedek and not Aaron. He had no sin. He gave himself as a sacrifice, and that his priesthood is eternal. And so Christ brings a better covenant. Remember the old covenant, the laws that Moses had given, that's the old covenant. Christ is going to give a new covenant, which is even better than the old covenant. Christ's work is in heaven, not in work, or not on earth. Now, that doesn't mean that Christ is not working for us here on earth. It just means that he has gone into the sanctuary now. All right, he stands before the Father. The tabernacle was kind of the place where Israel, the people would worship, and God would live in the most holy place, or thought to be in the most holy place. And so when Israel later builds their temple, God was still in this most holy place. And so Jesus goes into not this box, but he goes into heaven itself, because God could never be contained in a box, and the Israelites even knew that God couldn't be contained there. But he goes into this box was actually kind of a shadow of a reality, and that reality being heaven. And so Christ brings humans to God by going to heaven, and he provides a better covenant. So the law of Moses, right, represented the old covenant. Even writers in the Old Testament knew a new covenant was to come. And in this new covenant, God keeps the promise to bring salvation to all people. Salvation is not just simply going to heaven, but salvation is a restoring of all things. It is the defeat of death. It's bringing life back into this world. So this new covenant that Jesus brings is better than the old covenant. And so that's one of our key words. Covenant was just simply an agreement. And so Christ serves now, or brings this new covenant. And so then he also serves in a better tabernacle. Remember the tabernacle I mentioned just a little bit ago. There was a veil that separated the two parts of the tabernacle. And so Jesus is able to enter into this most holy of holy places. And in the old covenant, only the high priest went into the most holy place, and he only did this one time a year. And that was the Day of Atonement. The earthly tabernacle illustrates a spiritual truth. The old system of sacrifice did not bring salvation, right? It was just temporary. But Christ's tabernacle is heavenly. In other words, he goes into the heavens, and he's able to speak on our behalf. In verse 15, he says he is the mediator of a new covenant by means of death for the redemption of the transgression under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. So Christ is the sacrifice of this, is the sacrifice in the true tabernacle. Basically, what was temporary that didn't hold, this is going to hold. He's going to put away sin forever. He's going to deal with death forever. And that's his work on the cross. And so Christ is a better sacrifice, right? They would sacrifice the blood of animals to take away sins. But Jesus becomes the final sacrifice. He defeats death, right? He shames death. And it's not because God was angry that he pours out his wrath that Jesus dies, but that Jesus comes to earth. Humans reject Jesus. They seek to kill him. God allows this to happen. And in doing this, he swallows up death. And Jesus becomes obedient. And so he takes away the old and introduces something completely new. And so Christ becomes the final sacrifice. There's no need for animals anymore. He enters into the true sanctuary. And so this was the work of the high priest. And Jesus is our final high priest. His blood washes away sin. And so because of all this, in verse 23, this really becomes maybe a highlight of the book of Hebrews. He says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. In other words, because of who Christ is, what he has done for us, we should be getting excited. This is exciting stuff. Sin has been dealt with. Death has been dealt with. And so we were able to draw near to God. Let's encourage one another. Let's not forsake a meeting with one another. Let's not return to sin. And so this is really kind of a culmination of what's going on. And so then by the time we get to chapter 11, he gives these examples of faith. And I'm not going to go through them all, but this is how we're to live. And so The Hebrew writer tells us, hey, look at some of these people, what they did as they got excited for God. Abel, God accepted his sacrifice because of his faith. And Enoch, God took him to heaven because of his faith. And Noah, he builds an ark, and he goes on through these lists. And all these people died, right? But the encouragement is that they hadn't received the complete promise yet, but they were kind of like strangers and pilgrims on the earth. But we have this promise, and we see this fulfilled in Jesus. And so the writer is going to continue to talk about different people and their faith. And it's really just a way to say, hey, listen, God is doing something amazing and has done something amazing. And so these people, right, they didn't have the full promise. They didn't see everything that was coming, but they had a faith. Let that be an example for us, which ultimately then in chapter 12, he talks about Jesus. Jesus is the supreme example of faith. He says, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, he's probably talking about those in chapter 11, those who have run the race. He says, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Man, this is it. This is some exciting stuff. Look to Jesus. Look to those who have run the race, who are focused in on Jesus. Let's put away those things that are hurting us. And let's keep our eyes focused on Jesus. Jesus, he took care of everything. He's run the race. He's the author and finisher of what's going on, and he endured the cross. And so this is really an encouragement to believers, that because of what God has done through this high priest that we have, who's brought in this new covenant, who's higher than the angels, who's the perfect sacrifice, we can last through these difficult times. We can endure hardship and discipline. And he talks about earthly fathers, how they train their children. And so we have to look at, sometimes when we're going through difficult times, we can look at it in that manner. That it is a way of molding us to be a better person for Christ. So we pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord, right? We're looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. Do not refuse God's offer of salvation. In other words, this is what God's doing. Don't do that. Let's not allow bitterness. Let's not be sexually immoral. Let's not profane one another. And he highlights these two mountains, right? Mount Sinai, the old covenant, Mount Zion, the new covenant. And we're racing towards this new covenant. So that when we get into chapter 13, he gives some rules. Okay, here's how we're to live our lives, because we know all of this right now, right? Love's got to be the first rule. And then we want to practice hospitality. Let's not forget those who suffer, who are persecuted. Let's not defile our bodies, right, with wickedness. That's usually probably talking about sexual immorality. Let's not covet. Let's just know that, God has provided all we need. Let's respect those that are in leadership. Let's hang on to the right teaching, right? Let's be in the Word. Let's be focused on God. Let's be worshiping and praying. And that, my friend, is what we're to be up to. That's what we're to be focused on. So some great words, messengers of hope. I know as it's a little bit, may seem a little bit dry at the beginning of Hebrews, but it's building towards something. It's building towards Jesus, where we can fix our eyes on him. Well, until next week, may God bless you and your work for him.